Sergei Bulgakov was a Russian theologian, or rather a philosopher, who became an Orthodox theologian. He could be compared to the greats such as Karl Barth or Urs Balthasar in the Reformed and Catholic traditions, respectively, in terms of his significance and output. He was born in Russia in 1871, and then in the 1920s was expelled from what then became Soviet Russia by the direct orders of Lenin, and spent the rest of his life effectively a refugee in exile in Western Europe, first in Prague, and then most of his time he spent in Paris. And it's actually to Bulgakov that we owe also the concept of the Paris School of Orthodox Theology. If we were to think of its most significant figure, it would be specifically Bulgakov. So I mentioned the fact that he was a philosopher turned theologian. More precisely, he was trained in political economy, and in his early period, he actually was a Marxist. And it's meeting with the real Marxists in Germany during a business trip to Germany that changed his mind. And then subsequently, he underwent a complex intellectual and spiritual evolution from Marxism to idealism, to then Christian forms of idealism, and then to Orthodox theology, and eventually becoming in 1917, between the two revolutions in Russia, becoming an Orthodox clergyman, becoming a priest. Bulgakov did have indeed a central concept around which everything else in his theology revolved, and that is the notion of Sophia, the wisdom of God. And so he understood by Sophia the connecting link between God and the world. And the paradigmatic case of Sophia is effectively the second person of the Trinity incarnate. It's actually God who becomes human. And so Sophia in Russian, the term that's used is Bogochelovechestvo. I think the best translation for that is God-manhood, sometimes also translated as divine humanity. I'm not actually fond of that particular translation. But the fundamental point here is that Bulgakov saw in the salvific event of the divine incarnation effectively an insight into how being is. And so for him, God-manhood was a metaphysical principle. It was that connection between the uncreated creator and his creation, in which the drama of creation and salvation was reenacted. So it was Sophia, the wisdom of God, as presented in scripture, as it was also reflected in the Orthodox iconography. He has a lot to say about the Sophianic character of the Orthodox church buildings. For example, some of the main churches in the Orthodox traditions are dedicated to Sophia. We can think of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Constantinople, in Kyiv, in Novgorod, and elsewhere. And also, as of course reflected in the teachings of the church fathers. In addition to that, Bulgakov was also profoundly influenced by German mysticism, especially Jacob Boehme, and German idealism, especially Schelling and partially Hegel. When I say influenced, I do not mean that he simply took the ideas of these thinkers without a critical rethinking, but rather that he very often thought through questions of metaphysics having to do with being in and through the categories of German idealism. And so in German idealism, the question of the uniting of humanity and divinity, or how the divine renders itself present in creation, was a very significant matter, very significant question, especially in post-Kantian German idealism. Not for Kant himself, but for thinkers such as Schelling and Hegel. These were certainly significant matters. So what Bulgakov was trying to do, he was trying to think about the categories of Christian categories in the categories of German idealism, while avoiding the most significant pitfall of German idealism, namely monism and pantheism. So the concern was specifically to avoid this identification simply of God with creation, where God immanently disappears in creation, where God becomes a history and a part of creation to such an extent that creation and God become indistinguishable. That was actually already a preoccupation of Schelling, and it certainly was pretty significant for Bulgakov. How do you connect the divine and the human, but in such a way that the distinction, the ontological distinction between God and humanity is still preserved? One could very unambiguously characterize Bulgakov as a universalist. It's, of course, then becomes an interesting question, canonically and dogmatically speaking, whether somebody who believes in universal salvation could still be regarded as small o or a capital O Orthodox theologian. Bulgakov himself thought that he had a canonical loophole having to do with the fact that while universalism in its Origenist form, in the form that was espoused by Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century, while that form of universalism might have been condemned at one of the church councils, I think that's a plausible reading of history, Bulgakov believed that the universalism, for example, of St. Gregory of Nyssa, and that is the 4th century Cappadocian father, major church theologian of the so-called golden age of patristic theology, Bulgakov himself believed that that form of universalism of Gregory of Nyssa has actually never been condemned, and for that reason still could be rethought. Bulgakov's own conception of Orthodox theology was such that he believed that there were two non-negotiable doctrines, namely the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of the Incarnation, and most other Christian positions were such that there was a significant ground for freedom of expressing them, freedom of Christian conscience in believing one way or the other. And he believed that universalism and the doctrine of the church fell into that category of something that was not dogmatically defined. And I think, at least as far as the Christian East is concerned, he was on a sure foundation. So he doesn't have to say much specifically about hell. It's rather interesting that his teacher, Pavel Florensky, does have a lot to say about Gehenna and about the sufferings of hell. One important element of Bulgakov's thought is that it's not the case that he did not believe that there would not be purgative suffering. So he actually insisted on the fact that everybody undergoes purificatory or purgative suffering. And he believed that that was necessary, and in a sense that was included in this notion of filling up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. So if individual humans are a part of God-manhood, are a part of a constitutive in some mystical and universal sense of Christ's human nature, then it would follow that there is a sense in which they participate or undergo the suffering of Christ that he himself undergoes. I should also premises by saying that Bulgakov was a kenoticist. That is to say, he believed that incarnation required divine self-emptying and kenosis, but that would be a topic for a separate conversation. How did he conceive of hell? One significant element that he emphasizes is the fact that hell is created by humans themselves, that hell, even if we conceive of hell as a reality in which the sinners are being destroyed, his argument against the eternity of hell, and I would like to emphasize again the idea that he did not believe that hell was eternal. And of course, once you make hell a temporal reality, it's really no longer hell you're talking about, because it seems to me that if it's temporal, then ultimately there is no hell. All in the whatever eternity is to be attributed to creatures and God, there isn't going to be a state called hell. And so he did not believe that hell was eternal, and the reason for that, and the reason it was temporal, is because his argument is you cannot perpetually or ad infinitum destroy finite creatures. The point here is that there's a kind of a limit on creaturely destruction. So even if one is an annihilationist, and he considers that option, he considers the option what he calls a metaphysical suicide, he comes to the conclusion that annihilationism is not a cogent position to hold theologically, because it thwarts the designs of God for a particular creature. That is to say, it then commits one ultimately to a statement that God, in his foreknowledge, creates a creature which sort of has a kind of a trial run at existence, but ultimately has to be completely wiped out or destroyed. And he believes that any creature, to the extent to which existence or being is rendered to that creature, effectively participates in the good that is God. And because it participates in the good that is God, that good itself is not something that God will annihilate. So in other words, in any creature, no matter how bad or thwarted or evil or diabolical, and that applies actually even to the fallen angels. So in any creature, no matter how wicked, there is still an element of divine goodness left. There is no such a thing as a creature that is simply evil to core, or whose will is so bent on evil that, again, nothing good could be found or recognized in such a creature. And the reason he held that was because, again, of a deeply Platonist and idealist insight that Christians, of course, appropriated, this notion that, in a sense, without God, evil is nothing, that evil is parasitic upon the good, that evil is simply participation in non-being. And as a participation of non-being, it sort of makes no sense to say that somehow non-being has eternal capacity, has eternal quality of existence. And so in Bulgakov's mind, it's simply actually incoherent to hold that finite creatures can be infinitely punished. And so there is an ontological reason for that I've just articulated. Creatures being finite, it simply can actually take a finite time to simply destroy them. Destroying them is not an option because that thwarts the original purposes of God. So what are we left with? Well, we're left with a possibility of perpetual divine punishment. Bulgakov thought that the possibility of perpetual divine punishment is a huge problem, morally speaking. And that for two reasons. The first main reason is because no sin, no evil committed in time merits eternal punishment. In other words, it's incommensurable with the divine goodness to hold that if a sin has temporal significance, and even if it's an egregious sin, like even killing, let's say, participating in a genocide of a nation that President Putin is presently participating in. I mean, even if it's an egregious sin of that kind, it's still wrong for even that creature to be tortured eternally, because you're then providing an eternal punishment for something that is temporal. So the argument here is that it's incommensurable with divine goodness. Now, the potential objection to that is, and that was the medieval objection, is that actually any sin is an infinite offense against the divine honor. And so God being infinite, any sin, even sin in time, is still a violation of divine order and an offense against somebody whose dignity is infinite, and hence in itself is burdened with infinity. So Bulgakov doesn't buy this line of argument morally, and he believes that God might very well be an infinitely honorable object of worship, but God is also someone who is infinitely merciful and good. And so the goodness and graciousness of God certainly doesn't have to hold that infinite sin against the sinner for eternity. So the argument, therefore, is that it's either incompatible simply with sinning in time or incompatible with the infinite divine mercy. He uses this notion that's inaccurately attributed, very often attributed to Solzhenitsyn, and that is that the line between the good and evil effectively goes through each human heart individually. It's a very powerful notion. So you could also say, well, so that the line between the sheep and the goats, again, is something that goes through the human heart. So for him, therefore, hell primarily is understood as creatures' seclusion in the creaturely realm of some sort of self-absorption and imagined independence. In other words, there's no such thing, ontologically speaking, that cannot be creatures that are independent from God, because everything depends on God, and there's a kind of a pathos, if you will, of dependence on God in Bulgakov. I would argue that actually he's much more profound and much more interesting than Schleiermacher on that particular notion. In Schleiermacher, you get this wonderful and fuzzy feeling of absolute dependence. In Bulgakov, this is something that's underwritten ontologically, because frankly, I might not necessarily have any gefühl. I might not necessarily have any feeling of dependence. Lots of creatures don't have the feeling, but the point isn't actually some sort of quasi-psychological condition of humans. The point is, what is our very nature? What is dictated by the very structure of being? And as far as Bulgakov is concerned, any sort of rebellion against God ultimately is, of course, brings about self-destruction. And so I think his theology is profoundly really a theology of this total and complete immersion of creation in the reality of God, and really only finding its fulfillment in that reality. And so hell, therefore, is the condition that is profoundly untrue to who we are as humans. And we only find our reality as humans in, again, what he describes as divine humanity, or as Sophia. And then Sophia itself has these expressions. It's, of course, its most powerful instantiation as the second person of the Trinity, but also he conceives of the church as a divine human organism, and also as Sophia. And so there is a sense in Bulgakov that all creation is then, all cosmos is moving towards the self-realization where God is all in all. And the condition where God is all in all is such that it simply excludes the possibility of eternal hell. One interesting claim that he makes is that the judgment of God, the eschatological judgment of God, is not based on simply a divine law. A divine law might very well be significant, but for him, the judgment of God, the eschatological judgment, is in the comparison between what we were made to be, what we were meant to be in God, as those who are made in God's image and likeness. So it's the comparison of the person with the person's likeness in God. Some fathers make a distinction between the image and likeness, wherein the image is what we're given in creation, likeness is what we grow into. Bulgakov does not make that distinction consistently, and the distinction itself is not consistently made within the tradition. But it doesn't really matter. What matters, though, is the comparison between the empirical self. In other words, it's the self as it presents itself, if you will, before God, in God's presence, at a point of judgment, and the image, the intended likeness that exists eternally in Christ, in God. So there's a kind of a beautiful, I think, fusion both of solid Christianized Platonism here and also personalism. And the reason it's a deeply personalist vision, because notice it's a matter of that is really person related. One is comparing one's empirical self with one's ideal paradigm in God. And so then what is judgment? Bulgakov's argument is the judgment is the pangs of illuminated, enlightened conscience that are actually seeing that profound difference and the profound failure to fully realize the likeness. And then, of course, the mercy of God and the redeeming power of God's grace comes into play when ultimately, by God's grace, one is bumped then to the level of acquiring the image and likeness of God in the vision of God in the eschaton, or by uniting oneself to God. So I think that's a deeply compelling and profound image, and that is this image of comparison of an enlightened conscience, because of course our conscience is blinded by sin and by habits and everything else. But it's this comparison between who we are at present and what we are meant to be. So I think that insight especially is something I would want to share.